Hi friends, Miss Liz here. So today we're doing focaccia, which is a type of Italian flatbread. And for the base of this, a simple focaccia, we can actually use the base dough from our sandwich bread from the very first lesson that we did. So you can go back to that video and make your base dough exactly how we did it in that first video. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna mix up that dough. You're gonna let it rise until it about doubles, which is usually about an hour, hour and a half, depending on the temperature of your kitchen. And then you're gonna knock it down and deflate it. And then from that step where you would put it into a sandwich loaf pan or loaf bread pan, instead of doing that, we're gonna make it into a flatbread. So that's what I've done here. So I have my basic bread dough that's already done its first rise, and it's got a really nice elasticity, just like this. And so at this point, if I was making a sandwich loaf, I would go ahead and I would shape it and I would put it into a bread pan. But since I'm making a flatbread, I'm making a focaccia, I have a, what I call a jelly roll pan or a bar pan. So a pan that has a little bit of a ledge. I use stones. Yours might be metal, that's totally fine, but you need some kind of pan that has a little bit of an edge, or like a 9x13 pan, that would work fine, that has a higher side. I like a jelly roll pan because it's a little bit larger than a 9x13, but still has a little bit of a side. So what you're gonna do, you can either do this straight on your pan with oil, or you can lay some parchment paper first. I lay parchment paper first solely for the purpose of, one, it makes cleanup so much easier, and while it's cooling, I can lift the bread off of the pan and set it on my cooling rack. You do not have to use parchment paper. It's totally whatever your preference is. I just like to use parchment paper when I bake. Regardless of whether you're doing parchment paper or not, before we lay our bread, we're gonna douse this really well with some oil. I use olive oil, especially when you're making a nice traditional Italian bread. Olive oil gives it that like really beautiful Italian flavor. So you're just gonna take that oil and you're just gonna kind of spread it across the base of the pan. Okay. And then you're gonna take your bread here and you're just gonna give it a good stretch. Now you can definitely do this on the counter if you want. I like to just stretch it by hand because it's kind of fun when you've gotten a nice deflated bread. And it has a really pretty stretch to it. It's kind of fun to stretch by hand. So kind of just go for that elongated rectangle. Doesn't have to be perfect because we're gonna finish pressing it out in the pan. But just to give it that initial stretch with your hands is a little bit easier before you lay it down. Now if it's gotten a good stretch, the elasticity should relax a little bit. If you notice that it continuously shrinks down, let your bread rest a little bit longer so that elasticity can improve some. So we're just gonna kind of pull and stretch. And with that oil in the base of the pan, it's gonna slip around a little bit more. It's not gonna cling quite as much, that's okay. Just keep working it as best you can. Try to get it as close to all of the edges of your pan as possible. It doesn't have to go completely edge to edge because this dough is gonna grow. So it won't just grow up, it is gonna grow out a little bit. So just as close as you can to the edges of your pan. Nice stretch. Try to get your thickness about the same. If you notice it's quite a bit thicker in the center than it is on the side, you can kind of stretch from the middle instead of stretching your edges. Okay. So pretty close to all of your edges and corners, okay? So I'll show you pretty close, not all the way into the sides, but as I said, it is going to grow some. So then what you're gonna do, you're gonna take a little bit more oil and just a light drizzle across the top. And then you're gonna take your rosemary. Now you can use fresh rosemary if you want, or you can use dried. That's what I'm using today. Sometimes, especially in the summer, I have a friend who grows fresh rosemary. That is absolutely delicious. Depending on the season, it's a little bit harder to find fresh rosemary or it's really expensive. So dried crushed rosemary is totally fine. And I'm just gonna do a light sprinkle. I don't really measure this. I just do a light sprinkle so there's rosemary all across the top, okay? Just a light sprinkle. Rosemary has a very distinct strong flavor. So you don't need a ton, just a light sprinkle across with that oil. Then what you're gonna do is kind of take your fingers, and you can kind of, if you don't like greasy fingers, you can definitely use a basting brush. I just use my fingertips to kind of spread that oil and rosemary around the top. Make sure the oil's got a nice coat, just a thin coat across the top. Okay, and stretch any places where you feel like your dough retracted and pulled back a little. All right, so then once you have that spread in your pan, to give it a distinct focaccia texture, we're going to dimple the bread, which means you're gonna take your fingertips and you're literally just gonna take your hands like they're claws and just poke holes. Just all over, edge to edge, all over the top. Just poke some nice holes and try to get those holes like all the way to the bottom of the pan, because we want those dimples to stay even as the bread is rising and baking in the oven. We want that really nice textured look, that telltale focaccia texture. So we're just gonna dimple with our fingertips all the way to the bottom of the pan. Okay, all over. Really nice texture. Make sure you get it all the way to the edge. Okay. All over. Just like that. So we've got a really nice texture there. So then that's going to go into the oven at 400 degrees, about 20 minutes depending on your oven. It should get nice and golden, especially with the olive brushed on the top, olive oil brushed on the top. About 20 minutes, nice and golden. It does puff up some. It doesn't get super thick though, because this is a flatbread. Now, if you wanted it to be a little bit fluffier and a little bit thicker, you could let this rest on the counter for 20 to 30 minutes before you bake it. You do lose a little bit of that dimpling and a little bit of that flatbread texture, but if you were wanting to use it as a sandwich where you can slice it in half, you could give it a little bit of a lift by letting it rest a little bit longer. Otherwise, if you just want that really nice flatbread that makes a nice side piece, just go ahead and pop it straight into the oven now, 400 degrees, about 20 minutes, okay? As always, feel free to message me if you have any questions. I'm happy to help, and I hope your bread turns out delicious. Thanks.